Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Tracy Harris, and this is At Home in My Head, the podcast that explores experience and meaning and their impact on individuals and the broader society. While I was scripting this latest episode, the battle between Hamas and Israel broke out. Like a lot of other people, I've been seeing a lot of footage of the damage to towns in Israel and also the almost unbelievable destruction in populated areas of Gaza. Also, like a lot of other people, I have no idea how this is going to end, and I feel for anyone driven out of their homes by war. No food, no water, homes gone, families gone, hospitals overrun with children. I can't imagine what that's like. And I have that thought every time I see refugee situations. This episode is not about Israel or Gaza or Hamas. But because I know a lot of people feel ill-informed, I'm sharing some good coverage I saw on it just a few nights ago, and I know things are unfolding fast, but I think it's still relevant. That being said, I saw something shortly after the violence happened, which was a statement read on the news in the evening saying that there was some violent event at Columbia University Library, and also that Hamas had issued a statement calling for a day of rage that would have been this past Friday, which didn't spark widespread violence as some had feared. What struck me is that both Columbia University and that phrase, day of rage, were right out of this latest script. That phrase comes from a protest held in 1969 in the U.S. My first thought was that it was strange that Hamas would reach back to that. My next thought was that Hamas doesn't usually issue calls of this nature in English, so it was probably translated. I did find the original video call, and I'm not going to include or promote it in my links, but it is, as expected, in Arabic. I don't know who did the translation, and I don't know if the association was intentional or not. But before I get into this U.S. Days of Rage, I want to take a look at a passage from the September 20th, 2016 Time magazine article titled, "The Bombings of America That We Forgot." And I'd like to read you a passage from that article. It may be hard to recall now, but there was a time when most Americans were decidedly more blasé about bombing attacks. This was during the 1970s when protest bombings in America were commonplace, especially in hard-hit cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. Nearly a dozen radical underground groups, dimly remembered outfits such as the Weather Underground, the New World Liberation Front, and the Symbionese Liberation Army, set off hundreds of bombs during that tumultuous decade, so many, in fact, that many people all but accepted them as part of daily life. As one woman sniffed to a New York Post reporter after an attack by a Puerto Rican independence group in 1977, quote, "Oh, another bombing? Who is it this time?" unquote. By 1971, protest bombings had spread across the country. In a single 18-month period between 1971 and 1972, the FBI counted an amazing 2,500 bombings on American soil, almost 5 a day. Because they were typically detonated late at night, few caused serious injury, leading to a kind of grudging public acceptance. The deadliest underground attack of the decade, in fact, killed all of 4 people. In January 1975 bombing of a Wall Street restaurant. News accounts rarely carried any expression or indication of public outrage. And that's where I'm ending the passage from the Times article. I need to make clear, especially in light of recent global events, that this is a script I was already working on. There is no subtext or hidden message here intended for any events happening as I finalize the episode. It's like those movie disclaimers, except this script is nonfiction. It is about real people and our real past in the U.S., but any similarities to persons and events going down today are purely coincidental. Once there was a man named Paul Wolfe, and I have no idea who he was. and no amount of Googling cured my ignorance. Links to his name, when I can find them, lead to sites that have long been retired or replaced, domains that are no longer available. I'm not saying that information about Paul Wolf can't be found. I'm certainly not the be-all and end-all of scouring the internet, but I just expected that finding out who he was wouldn't be this hard. The few hits I got showed he was credited with transcribing a paper titled Warrantless FBI Electronic Surveillance from April 1976. His name is hyperlinked, but if you click it, it takes you to another paper at the Wayback Machine Internet Archive titled Supplementary Detailed Staff Reports on Intelligence Activities and the Rights of Americans, Book 3, which appears to be tied to the earlier paper. Again, he's credited with having provided transcription services, and when you click his hyperlinked name at the bottom of this page, you get a sales pitch for internet services. But Paul Wolf wasn't just a transcriptionist. In fact, whoever he is or was, he presented a paper titled COINTELPRO, The Untold American Story, to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. The paper included contributions by some prominent people like law professor Kathleen Cleaver, linguist Noam Chomsky, and historian and political scientist Howard Zinn. But I don't know whether they were simply people whose work is used in the report or if they actively participated in some way. The only part of the paper with Wolf's name is the byline credit, and in the citations at the end, where he's archived several related papers at his website, which is the site that is now decommissioned. All of the citations tied to his own site feature input from someone named Ward Churchill. Churchill, from what I could find, is a colorful but also sketchy and problematic source. But fortunately, a lot of the presentation paper, at least up to where I've read so far, is based on information that can be easily fact-checked by the government's own records, based on what came out of the office break-in that ultimately exposed the COINTELPRO operations. The paper mentions some of the issues we've addressed already in prior episodes, but one that I haven't looked into yet is the focus on student groups. FBI operations successfully broke Black Power movements and Native American movements and even socialist movements. The paper, at least at the time it was written, claims the U.S. is alone among the world's parliamentary democracies in that it has no mass-based socialist party, however mild or reformist. I don't know if there are any other countries in the same predicament, but I can confirm that in the U.S. this is very true. Not only do we not have any strong socialist movements, but also no other movements that would pose a substantial threat or challenge to the existing political and economic power and authority of our two-party stalemate. In past episodes, we saw the energy the state was willing to put into shutting down these movements, not just in the past, but even applying these tactics today to destroy or substantially weaken the impact of potentially effective activism that starts to take root. And while we haven't always had a codified right to be free from political persecution in this country, the concept of free speech, that political ideas and communication won't be met with government persecution, has been a persistent myth in spite of a demonstrated reality to the contrary. We saw examples of government institutions as part of their standard processes lying, spreading disinformation, ruining reputations, spreading distrust and propaganda, threatening people, harassing them with wrongful arrests, searches, and even violence and orchestrated assassinations. Not because these movements had done anything to break laws, but because they challenged existing power structures in favor of greater social equity and were beginning to gain ground with charismatic leadership and growing memberships running programs to fight injustice and serve vulnerable populations like families facing food insecurity. What I found, the more I looked into these stories, is that a lot of what happened during the years that COINTELPRO was in operation wasn't known to me. And when I started talking about it, I saw a lot of other people right here in the U.S., even those who were alive during these years, also had no idea any of this was going on, or maybe they had some vague recollection. And with every story I decided to tell, there would be a dozen more avenues I could have gone down with something just as interesting and infuriating that happened to this other person or this group or community at the hands of U.S. institutions of justice that were promoted as keeping us safe from fascism and authoritarianism, but that in reality were violently enforcing the status quo of our systems right here at home. And this is the cycle that would be perpetuated. Number one, a marginalized group with little resource or platform would decide to organize. Number two, the moment they would start to succeed and even look remotely like they might in the future be capable of achieving meaningful change, they'd be met with extreme intimidation, threat, and violence from our existing institutions. Number three, these people working hard for change had a lot of reason to want change, to want equity and opportunity and access to resources. They were being denied respect and humanity and equitable access to necessary resources like basic housing, food, education, justice, self-determination. All the things that many of us feel we have, they were being denied these things and organizing to work to gain these things, often providing for their own communities using cooperative grassroots programs. Number four, eventually, if a group that's abused tries to improve their situation nonviolently and is repeatedly met with violence and intimidation from a state, they're going to grow more and more desperate and frustrated. The lid on that pressure cooker is going to blow off. This is why Martin Luther King Jr. called riot the language of the unheard in a speech where he said he was still committed to nonviolent means. It's why he said, quote, "It is not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible for me to do that without at the same time condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that exist in our society. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative than to engage in violent rebellions to get attention," unquote. I have a little godchild now. They aren't talking yet, and sometimes they need something and I can't figure out what it is they're asking for. They don't have words, they have limited communication, and when enough time goes by without their needs being met, the screaming starts. This is frustration coming out. This is probably the most understandable human response I've ever seen. If someone were to say they don't understand this, I'd find it pretty hard to believe. And even though adults can regulate better in general, we still know that feeling of frustration even in minor situations. In traffic, waiting for a computer that's taking too long to process something. But imagine you don't have food. Imagine you have kids and they don't have food. That your water has been cut off, or you just got an eviction notice and you have no job prospects. Imagine this is by design, not due to some unavoidable natural reality. Your society is literally set up to allow this to happen to you. So you want change. You are desperate for change. You need change just to be able to provide a minimally basic level of existence for yourself and the people you care about. And when you try to request it, you have no voice. You are denied a voice. You're told it's your own fault, that you and your kids don't deserve to eat, don't deserve to be housed, don't deserve to live in a safe area with a good school. So you start working with others in your community to provide these things for each other. And some like-minded people outside your immediate group begin to see this and participate. And you start to talk about how great it would be if everyone were looked after this way and how we all deserve to eat and have housing. And suddenly, there are cars parked across the street from your house every night. You're getting threatening notes left in your mailbox. You get arrested for something you didn't do and you spend time in a cell waiting for a trial just to see the charges dropped at the last second. Or to see somebody you barely know claiming you told them you'd done illegal things. You or your friends get assaulted or killed by the very law enforcement bodies you're told are there to protect you and your community. Eventually, and for me at least, understandably, people are going to start pushing back. Not by using aggressive violence, though, because it's defensive. It's self-defense. We all should be able to advocate for ourselves and each other and provide for ourselves and each other and defend ourselves and each other against state authority that stands in our way when we try to do that peacefully. So number 5 on my list would be, since you're a marginalized community, you don't have a huge platform and you aren't the president, you aren't a congressperson, you aren't the head of the FBI, you don't have the media at your fingertips. And so the narratives that people hear all come from the very people who are threatening, harassing, and abusing you. The first time anyone outside your community hears about you, it's disinformation coming out of a COINTELPRO operation that portrays you as militant and extremist, a community willing to take up arms and use them against our U.S. values and way of life. To us, then, these people are introduced as terrorists for trying to improve life in their difficult communities. I think part of what puts it in perspective for me are segments like a recent PBS segment where they noted that the Proud Boys played a critical part in carrying out the January 6th attack. And that group is just one part of a trend of white supremacy and far-right violence that leaves many marginalized citizens in fear to walk down public streets. Some of the top law enforcement officials have called these movements the biggest domestic terrorism threat facing the country. And for what? Literally, they stormed and breached the Capitol and ultimately got people killed because they weren't happy with an election outcome. To me, that's a group of dangerous people. People who are not facing oppression, but who simply cannot deal with losing one election cycle without trying to overturn the entire election process and assassinate elected leaders. People walking the streets who get violent when they don't get their way, even when they have nothing actually at stake, are scary people. People walking the streets who will get violent if you threaten their safety or the safety of their families, those people don't scare me. But people running our systems who are willing to violently enforce intolerable levels of inequity, that's who scares me. Whether I would engage in violence or not, at least I understand their motivation. I get why they feel desperate because their needs are not being met. But all of that was just to set the stage for what I want to talk about today, and since this episode is labeled as part of the History Erased series, you know we're going back in time. From 1963 to 1968, a group known as the Students for a Democratic Society undertook something called the Economic Research and Action Project in Northern Urban Neighborhoods. The project focused on creating an interracial movement around people in poverty to organize and advocate for full and fair employment or a guaranteed annual income, as well as guaranteed political rights for those same citizens. In essence, they wanted a more democratic society. One author described the goals as guaranteed political freedom, economic and physical security, abundant education, and incentives for wide cultural variety. And they were creating this movement through campus organizing that was then expanded into larger community organizing. So the group was an activist student group and part of something that was being labeled as the New Left. Skipping back to that presentation by Paul Wolfe to the UN, there are some quotes that came out of the COINTELPRO documents that mentioned the New Left. In the context of explaining the FBI's focus on and interference with these groups, it says, quote, "The movement of rebellious youth known as the New Left, involving and influencing a substantial number of college students, is having a serious impact on contemporary society with a potential for serious domestic strife," unquote. It described the movement as having revolutionary aims and an identification with Marxism-Leninism. It goes on to describe how the group has tried to infiltrate and radicalize labor, and that after the mass media refused to allow them a platform, they established a large network of underground publications which served a dual purpose of an internal communication network and an external propaganda organ. The memo further states that New Left leadership openly stated their sympathy with the international communist revolutionary movements in South Vietnam and Cuba, and have directed others into activities which support these movements. Everything I just read and quoted is legal, with the exception of revolutionary aims, which could mean violence. Assuming this is regarding violent overthrow, there would be laws against that in the U.S. But liking Marx or Lenin, printing up and distributing literature to help you get your ideas out, reaching out to other groups and communities with your messaging, or believing and expressing that the U.S. action in another country is objectionable, all of that is supposed to be protected. That is, the government isn't supposed to target you for any of that. It's not supposed to get you surveilled. I don't much care for the U.S. founders because the only rights they cared about were their own. But there was one thing they wrote that was something I could get behind, maybe with a little less sexism and theism, but the foundational idea still seems solid to me. And that is a passage out of the Declaration of Independence. For folks outside the U.S., the Declaration of Independence carries no legal weight in the United States, even though some citizens treat it like it does. A lot of times things that are in the Declaration are misquoted as being from the Constitution, but the two documents are not even in the same ballpark. The Constitution is supposed to be a foundational document that sets up the new state system, whereas the Declaration was written before the U.S. was even a country. There hadn't even been a revolution fought yet. And the Declaration of Independence was pretty much just that. These folks were declaring their bid for independence from British rule. And that document explained their reasoning behind it. In essence, it's a justification for revolution. So let's read a passage from the Declaration talking about why revolution. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government, and to provide new guards for their future security. In summary, they're saying the purpose of government is to secure your rights. And when the government fails to do that, when it becomes oppressive, it takes a lot to make people get on board with change. But that eventually, that's exactly what needs to happen. We all know that when they said all men, they did actually intend to exclude anyone who wasn't a man, and they didn't even mean actually all men, because a lot of men, they went on to deny all of these things they claimed need to be guaranteed by a legitimate government. But after those caveats, if someone wants to actually apply this to all the citizens and residents within a nation's borders, I'm on board with this idea that when a government stands in the way of citizens being allowed to survive or thrive, when a government becomes destructive to those ends, the citizenry doesn't just have a right, but an actual duty to put an end to it and institute something that does serve the people. Not everyone will agree with that, and that's okay. I would never say that just because the founders said it, or just because it resonates with me, it's gospel truth. I'm just saying it's part of the question that surrounds this story that we'll be looking at in this episode. Whether we agree with it or not, whether we like it or not, it's part of U.S. history that a lot of people today don't remember clearly. And the point of the History Erased series is to focus on these parts of our history that have been or are being erased. At first, when I started digging into this, I felt like it was strange that I didn't remember it, but then bits and pieces started coming back to me. When I was a kid in school, bomb threats were very common. We had a couple every year. We would march out of the school, standing in the parking lot or in a field nearby with a teacher or a coach, and wait for the okay to re-enter. Sometimes these were just fire drills, but it wasn't uncommon to have a bomb scare at school. However, unlike today's school shootings, ours were nearly always pranks. I also remember something called the Anarchist Cookbook. It's actually still available online, and the book description at one site reads, quote, "The Anarchist Cookbook will shock, it will disturb, it will provoke. It places in historical perspective an era when turn on, burn out, blow up are revolutionary slogans of the day. Says the author, this book is not written for the members of fringe political groups such as the Weathermen or the Minutemen. Those radical groups don't need this book. They already know everything that's in here. If the real people of America, the silent majority, are going to survive, they must educate themselves. That is the purpose of this book." In what the author considers a survival guide, there is explicit information on the uses and effects of drugs, such as pot and heroin. There is detailed advice concerning electronics, sabotage, and surveillance, with data on everything from bugs to scramblers. There's a comprehensive chapter on natural, non-lethal, and lethal weapons, running the gamut from cattle prods to submachine guns to bows and arrows. The section on explosives and booby traps ranges from TNT to whistle traps. 111 drawings supplement the recipes. This book is for anarchists, says William Powell, those who feel able to discipline themselves on all subjects from drugs to weapons to explosives that are currently illegal in this country. Techniques, disciplines, precautions, and warnings pervade what may be the most disquieting how-to book of contemporary times. And that's the end of the description. So back to the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. It started in 1960, and during the next several years it grew to 300 campus chapters and 30,000 supporters. After their last convention in 1969, almost a decade later, the group splintered. And it wasn't until almost 40 years later, in 2006, that a new national network arose that adopted the same name, Students for a Democratic Society, or New Students for a Democratic Society, the new SDS. The 2006 rebirth was centered around the U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, and represented a goal of rebuilding the 1960s organization. According to Wikipedia, the SDS of the 1960s was the largest radical student organization in U.S. history. I'm not sure how I'd even know how to confirm that, but there it is. The rebirthed SDS, however, is not the topic today. Today, I want to look at what was unfolding in the 1960s during a very volatile time. The original organization was centered around opposition to U.S. aims in Vietnam and also black civil rights. In 1962, for their first national convention, SDS created a manifesto at a United Auto Workers retreat outside Port Huron, Michigan. Walter Reuther, who was then in leadership at the UAW, paid for a lot of the expenses for that first SDS convention and allowed the student group use of the retreat. Under Reuther's leadership, UAW became one of the most progressive labor unions in U.S. history, focusing not just narrowly on labor issues, but also on social justice and human rights. Reuther might actually be a good topic for another day, along with the Auto Workers Union, but I don't want to get too far off topic. Some of the problems that Reuther tackled, though, just with the union, included unsafe assembly line speeds. Workers were losing limbs and lives in those conditions, and it reminded me of some of the worker safety issues raised in the book Fast Food Nation. I should note the fictionalized film version was nothing like the book, so if you saw the movie, you may be wondering what I'm talking about. But by staging a strike in the form of a sit-in, where entry into the plant was blocked, Reuther was able to negotiate equal pay for equal work for women employees, slowing down the dangerous assembly lines, and securing guarantees that workers could not be terminated for joining the union. Before that strike, the membership for UAW Local 174 was just 200. After the strike, it grew to 35,000 in just 1 year. And Reuther saw the SDS as a group with shared vision and values. When I found the manifesto online as a scanned PDF, right off the bat I noticed that the original draft was created by Tom Hayden, so of course I wanted to know who Tom Hayden was. In addition to drafting the Port Huron Statement for SDS, he was married for a time to Jane Fonda and served in the California Senate. Oh, and he also stood trial with the Chicago Seven, which included Abby Hoffman and 5 others who all probably have their own interesting stories to tell. The summary of the Chicago Seven is that they were defendants in a trial charged and eventually acquitted of conspiracy. A few of them, not including Hayden, were convicted of crossing state lines to incite a riot, and 2 were charged and acquitted of teaching demonstrators how to build bombs. All convictions were reversed on appeal, and the U.S. government stopped pursuing the case at that point. The judge in the case, Julius Hoffman, still convicted the defendants and their attorneys for contempt and sentenced them to jail terms from a few months to a few years. Those convictions were also appealed and retried before a different judge and vacated. So many stories, so many questions, and it never ends. But that's a little about Tom Hayden, who drafted the manifesto. The document is 66 pages. It's over 25,000 words. I'm including a link to the PDF in the description. I started to peruse it, but I did not read it. If you want to read it in full, there it is. At a page on the manifesto at the University of Michigan website, it offers a summary of the document as follows. The Port Huron Statement called for the growth and implementation of participatory democracy across college campuses in the South and in inner cities. The writers of the document believed that ordinary citizens, particularly students, could create change through nonviolent means. They saw the effectiveness of the Young Civil Rights Protesters of Students' Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC, and argued that their radical tactics of meeting racism and segregation head-on were inspiring. They wanted to use these same tactics to achieve their goals. According to Hayden, the idea of participatory democracy was particularly important because it made you take action without being a dogmatist. It led to the idea of going to the people and listening to them and the construction of a decision. The Port Huron Statement's main concern was reforming American policy, politics of the left, and the university. The authors of the document saw the nuclear arms race brought on by the Cold War as the greatest threat to peace and security around the world. Therefore, Students for a Democratic Society called for the reformation of nuclear energy policy and armament in order to avoid the unimaginable. The writers of the statement saw American political bureaucracy, specifically within the Democratic Party, as the reason for the stalemate towards racial and economic progress. The Port Huron Statement called for voter registration of African Americans in the South and more liberal candidates in order to change the philosophies and practices of the Democratic Party. Lastly, these young writers of the Port Huron Statement saw universities that they were attending as forces against free speech and free thought. They saw them as colossal, rigid institutes that dictated the lives of students too much and prepared them for the workforce and nothing else. These students demanded free speech and the ability to think and act freely on campus. The mega universities needed to open themselves up to intellectual conversation. And that's the end of the statement at the University of Michigan website. It's actually kind of creepy to read parts of the document or summaries like these and realize that if they were published yesterday, they could almost just as easily apply to issues in context today. It feels like we forgot our history and now we're repeating it. Literally, as I was putting that summary into the episode's script, I just finished watching a panel of high school students preparing for college. When the moderator asked which of them were pursuing their passions, as opposed to a degree in a career intended to pay off their student loans, none of them raised their hands. And one of them talked specifically about how unfulfilling that reality is for her. I think about that, and also the right-wing takeovers of universities that we're watching currently, and it's eerie how these words, written more than 60 years ago, reflect a problem we are still facing today. It's amazing how many movements in the 2000s have just been continuations of movements that erupted in the last century but were never resolved. Until we face it and fix it, we'll continue to fight these same battles. Martin Luther King Jr. said it well in his speech, The Other America. Quote, "Now every year about this time, our newspapers and our televisions and people generally start talking about the long hot summer ahead. What always bothers me is that the long hot summer has always been preceded by a long cold winter. And the great problem is that the nation has not used its winters creatively enough to develop the program, to develop the kind of massive acts of concern that will bring about a solution to the problem. And so we must still face the fact that our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. As long as justice is postponed, we always stand on the verge of these darker nights of social disruption. The question now is whether America is prepared to do something massively, affirmatively, and forthrightly about the great problem we face in the area of race, and the problem which can bring the curtain of doom down on American civilization if it is not solved." Unquote. You cannot fix what you will not face. In early 1965, singer and songwriter Bob Dylan released an album, Bringing It All Back Home, which featured the single Subterranean Homesick Blues. One music reviewer described how an entire generation recognized the zeitgeist in the verbal whirlwind of Subterranean Homesick Blues. The song touches on drug culture, counterculture, police and community conflict, and civil rights struggles, and in one line Dylan sings, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." During the community organizing work that was going on in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods by the SDS, some members began to see what was unfolding. Things like the impact of COINTELPRO and the assassination of Fred Hampton. This was a few years before COINTELPRO was nationally exposed, but the COINTELPRO operations were still in full swing. So it was happening, and the communities that were experiencing it were aware that it was going on. They just didn't have the documents yet to prove it. But as it became clear that the state was not going to allow political speech or movements or community activism that challenged the status quo, that these people and groups and programs would be met with state violence and harassment, some of these SDS members decided that there would be no chance at deep social change through community organizing and electoral politics because the system itself was proving to be the problem. Based on what they were confronted with, it became clear to them that more radical disruption was required. At an SDS convention in Chicago in 1969, the SDS was fracturing. A group labeled Progressive Labor packed the convention with supporters, and at the start of the convention, 2 position papers were passed out by the national office leadership. One was a revised statement of a manifesto from the Revolutionary Youth Movement, or the RYM, which represents much of the SDS existing leadership. The other was a paper titled, "You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows." This second paper was put forward by a faction that would come to be known as the Weathermen, or their organization name, Weather Underground. The document had 11 signatures and called for the creation of a clandestine revolutionary party. I'm adding a link to the text of the position paper in the description for anyone who would like to read it. Let's step into the time machine again and go back to Chicago one night on May 4th, 1886, in the Haymarket district. An outdoor meeting had been quickly organized by anarchist activists to protest the violent deaths of workers during a labor lockout the previous day in another area of the city. The meeting attracted people who gathered to hear speakers who addressed political, social, and labor issues. At some point in the evening, 175 police officers marched on the meeting, which up to that point had been peaceful. The police started demanding that the speakers cease and the crowd disperse. In response, one person hurled a bomb at the police line. To this day, no one knows who threw it. Several police and bystanders died. But in the aftermath, the organizers and speakers were arrested, unfairly tried, and sentenced to death, despite never being tied to the bombing. There is currently a memorial dedicated to the workers and activists, but there has also been one dedicated to the police who marched on a peaceful civilian meeting that night. This second memorial, the one dedicated to the police, is described at the website for the Chicago Monuments Project as the monument in Chicago that has, quote, suffered more abuse than any other work of public art in Chicago. Dedicated in 1889 at the bombing site and paid for by private citizen donations, this memorial to citizen oppression has itself been bombed twice, hit by a streetcar in an accident, moved 4 times, and now sits on the grounds of a police training center. Unquote. The first bombing of the memorial took place on October 6, 1969. 5 years later, in 1974, Weather Underground published a 188-page manifesto called Prairie Fire, where they took credit for the bombing. The second bombing occurred exactly 1 year later, also on October 6, 1970, after the monument had been rebuilt. Again, destroyed by Weather Underground. This went through a third cycle until the city finally gave up and relocated it to the police facility. But the first bombing in 1969 occurred just days before something called the Days of Rage. The goal of the Days of Rage was to, quote, bring the war home, unquote. The Weathermen felt the U.S. public was too apathetic to what was happening in Vietnam and needed a wake-up call. Although they'd planned for thousands, only a few hundred people showed up for the event. Still, with only a few hundred there, they rampaged through the Gold Coast neighborhood, smashing the windows out of bank buildings and cars on the street. Wearing motorcycle and football helmets, the rioters made it 4 blocks before they ran into police barricades. During the clash with over 1,000 police, large amounts of tear gas were used and police rammed the crowds with cars at least twice. All of this lasted about half an hour. But 28 cops were injured, 6 weathermen were killed, a number of police were injured, and 68 arrests were made. After that, for the next 2 days, the weathermen stood down, but the revolutionary youth movement continued with peaceful rallies at different locations, including a courthouse, a factory, and a hospital. On Friday, October 9th, the RYM led an interracial march of 2,000 people through a Spanish-speaking part of Chicago. This ended up being the largest event held at the Days of Rage. The following day, on October 10th, the Weathermen regrouped and resumed their demonstrations. About 300 of them marched through Chicago's business district, overseen by a large and heavily armed police presence. The protesters still managed to break through the police lines and raged through the district, again smashing windows out of buildings and cars. The police were more prepared, though, and contained the riot within 15 minutes, arresting more than half the crowd. The total cost to the city was estimated in 1960s dollars at $183,000 compared to the $243,000 in bail that was paid to release the Weathermen. In December of 1969, in response to increased pressure from police, the Weather Underground actually decided to operate underground and turn to guerrilla warfare tactics against the U.S. government. As an aside, this decision was made at meetings in Flint, Michigan, where decades later, in 2014, 100,000 residents, including thousands of children, would be exposed to elevated lead in their water 4 government officials, 1 from the city, 2 from the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, and 1 from the EPA, resigned over the mishandling of the crisis, and 1 MDEQ staffer was fired. In 2021, 7 years later, former Michigan Governor Rick Snyder and 8 other officials were charged with 34 felony counts and 7 misdemeanors for their role in the crisis. 2 officials were charged with involuntary manslaughter. 15 criminal cases have been filed against local and state officials, but only 1 minor conviction has been obtained, and all other charges have been dismissed or dropped. In 2020, the victims were awarded $600 million, which grew to $641 million, and after a massive spend and effort, Flint has now corrected the problem with their water pipes. But residents are still understandably distrustful. I think the Flint situation is a good example of how, even in a supposed democratic state, you still see the institutions of power abusing citizens to death to cut costs and avoid accountability. For some reason, when institutions are used to kill people, we get angry, but we don't look at it and think of it as violence, even though physical harm and death result. But if these people were to break with the institutions that killed and harmed them and their children, and inflict street justice, we'd bring the hammer of these same institutions down on their heads to punish them for trying to impose the justice denied by a system that hides the violence it inflicts and doesn't treat it with the gravity it deserves. That is, when it comes to institutional violence against citizens and residents, it's harder to see, and accountability either doesn't come at all, or comes in forms we would never call accountability if it were citizen and resident violence against the institution. These people who died or were harmed are no less dead or harmed than if the government had shown up at their homes and killed them hands-on. But for some reason, if we do it through the filter of a bureaucracy, big charges are brought, but ultimately they get away with it with a slap on the wrist compared to what would have happened to them if they used a non-institutional weapon like a gun or a bomb to wreak the same havoc. I suggest that maybe we need to stop looking at harm perpetuated by the state as somehow legitimate or civil and start seeing it for the criminal violence that it is. And not just see it that way, but treat it that way. And stick with stories like Flint to make sure that real justice is done and accountability applied, because it almost never is. We hear about the convictions and think justice was served, but we don't see the headlines later when the charges are dropped or the sentencing is reduced. Why do we react with shock when we hear about the days of rage, but consider the atrocities of Vietnam to be unfortunate costs of war? Why do we consider the execution of Fred Hampton as just a corrupt justice system and accept the outcome where no one was ever held accountable for that murder? Why are the deaths in Flint being resolved with fines but not imprisonment or criminal charges that actually stick? When the state perpetuates it, we repackage outright murder or negligence resulting in death, which should be criminal, as something else, and then go on as though that's just the way it is. Our outrage dies down, it becomes history, and the people responsible go on with their lives. And the victims and their families and communities are told to just forget about it and go on with their lives as well, as though nothing ever happened. Sometimes being paid to forget about it, but sometimes not. This is why it never gets resolved, because there is no resolution being offered or provided. It's why we keep experiencing the same cycle over and over as a society, like some lethal version of Groundhog Day, where people in power abuse the rest of us to literal death and throw money at us for lives lost and damage done. A fine to wealthy people and institutions isn't really a penalty. It's not accountability, it's using money to avoid accountability and responsibility. And in the case of suing a state entity, it's the victims themselves contributing tax dollars that are paying their own fines. If the state or the city of Flint pays the victims, Flint actually funded the victim compensation through victim tax dollars over the years, kind of how a health savings account works, where you pay your insurance company to hold your money in an account so you can pay your own medical bills later. How is that accountability or a penalty for the people who perpetuated this? It's unjustified to keep asking communities to swallow and digest all this violence and hold no one to account, to deny them justice and tell the victims to please not express any outrage over the fact that we're not doing anything to actually guarantee it won't keep happening. We change the form of the violence, but we don't stop the violence, and it is violence when we're killing people or damaging their very bodies. In 1970, New York Supreme Court Justice M. Murtaugh was presiding over pretrial hearings of a group called Panther 21. They were members of the Black Panther Party accused of plotting to bomb New York landmarks and department stores. On February 21st of that same year, 3 Molotov cocktails exploded in front of the judge's house, doing property damage but no physical harm to anyone in the house. Messages were painted in red letters on the sidewalk in front of the home that read, "Free the Panther 21" and "Viet Cong have won." Earlier that same day, there were other Molotov cocktail attacks that were never tied to the incidents at Judge Murtaugh's home, although, for obvious reasons, some people suspected there was an association. In a communication in December of that same year, 2 members of the Weather Underground declared that the firebombing at the judge's home was an effort to show support for the Panther 21 and was carried out by 4 of their New York members. It was only a few weeks after that firebombing that 5 New York weathermen from the same cell were manufacturing bombs in a residential location where one exploded, killing 3 of them and injuring 2 others. It was later claimed by researchers that the bombs were intended for strikes against the Fort Dix military base and the Columbia University Library, and that several other bombs in the Detroit area were successfully defused based on information from an informant. If researchers are correct, the Fort Dix bomb would have detonated at a social event featuring non-commissioned officers and guests, potentially killing or harming a few dozen people. As an interesting aside, the site of this explosion was the former home of Charles Merrill, whose name probably means nothing to anyone listening, until U.S. listeners hear the corporate name Merrill Lynch and envision the iconic bull market logo. Merrill's son, James, actually published a poem called 18 West 11th Street that memorialized the explosion. In a documentary, one of the early leaders of Weather Underground, Bill Ayers, had this to say: "We were very careful from the moment of the townhouse on to be sure we weren't going to hurt anybody, and we never did hurt anybody. Whenever we put a bomb in a public space, we had figured out all kinds of ways to put checks and balances on the thing, and also to get people away from it, and we were remarkably successful." Unquote. After the murders of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, which were addressed in another episode on the illegal and abusive COINTELPRO operations, Weather Underground issued a declaration of war against the U.S. government. And again, it's hard to consider something like this without considering the context. The U.S. Department of Justice had gone rogue, and the U.S. government wasn't stopping it. How can there be due process, which is the means of peaceful resolution, when the entire institution is breaking the law all the way to the top? It's like asking someone who has a mafia hit out on their life to go and talk to the mob boss to report a hitman is trying to kill them and they need help. I mean, the mob boss is the one who authorized the hit, so what are citizens supposed to do in response to a government that's behaving more like a mafia? This was not just a situation where I don't like a particular policy. It was a government violently stomping out any challenge to the status quo and destroying any person or group that dared to stand up to it. This is something that requires consideration. In the U.S., we had a government literally murdering people, not for breaking laws, but for questioning racism, for asking if we should reconsider the political and economic status quo, or for suggesting we stop trying to install authoritarian regimes in other countries where the people were fighting to control their own resources. In the U.S., citizens being harassed, abused, and murdered knew they were being targeted. But until the FBI break-in that exposed the COINTELPRO operations, there was no way to prove it and no way to get a platform large enough to let everyone else know. So the state not only controlled the violence, but the narrative of the violence. I honestly can't say what a right response would be to a situation that isn't right and shouldn't be. But Weather Underground decided the right response was war against the perpetrators of that injustice. So, in May of 1970, they issued a statement saying that they would attack a U.S. symbol or institution of American injustice. 2 weeks came and went, and nothing happened. But just 2 days outside of that window, they blew up a New York City police station with a bomb that included 10 sticks of dynamite. 6 minutes prior, they issued a warning, and afterwards they assumed responsibility for the blast. 13 members were indicted for a national bombing conspiracy. Later that same year, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, an international psychedelic drug distribution organization, paid the Weather Underground to break Timothy Leary out of a California prison and transport him and his wife to Algeria, where they joined former Black Panther Party leader Eldridge Cleaver. Then in March 1971, the group set off a bomb on the Senate side of the U.S. Capitol. It smashed windows and caused significant property damage, but there were no casualties. A year later, in May 1972, on Ho Chi Minh's birthday, they planted a bomb in a restroom in the Air Force wing of the Pentagon. Property damage from the blast and subsequent flooding included loss of computer files with classified information. The bombing was a protest against the U.S. raid against Hanoi, and the attack was celebrated by groups worldwide who shared the Weather Underground's sentiments on U.S. global interventions. Bear in mind that 0 lives were lost in the bombing of the Pentagon. In contrast, in 1995, Vietnam released estimates that 2 million civilians were killed in a violent conflict that the United States never even bothered to officially declare was even a war. In an interesting twist, in 1973, the U.S. government dropped charges against the Weather Underground members for the Pentagon bombing, citing a recent SCOTUS ruling that a court order is required for electronic surveillance. And without information gathered illegally by the Justice Department, they had no case. The government also had to weigh how much foreign intelligence they might want to have to reveal in a court case. Other fun facts about how the rogue DOJ was doing business: illegal entries, basically letting themselves into buildings without warrants, opening people's mail, which violates federal laws around U.S. mail and privacy, straight-up burglaries, and even dragging the CIA into it to use these same illegal tactics, not just against suspected perpetrators, but against anyone who knew them, other groups or people who supported them, friends, family members, all of this once more as an extension of that so illegal why were none of these cops put in prison COINTELPRO operation. What are laws even for if the government that creates them behaves as though they aren't in place? And why were none of these people who participated in this ever held to account? The people they went after sometimes were exonerated, but sometimes spent decades in prison or went to the grave having done nothing wrong, or having done nothing worse than what COINTELPRO was doing itself. Here's what happened to a few people, though. L. Patrick Gray was the FBI director as all this was going down. And as a result of all this blowing out of the water, he resigned. And while that's technically a consequence in the most pedantic way, considering the trail of damage, he got off pretty light. There were federal indictments against 2 people, someone named Edwin Miller, and like a lot of these corrupt enforcement agents or sources, his online history has been pretty well scrubbed. If anyone knows anything about him, feel free to add something in comments. I can't even tell you anything else about this man. Additionally, there was an indictment against W. Mark Felt, and Felt does have a wiki page and an online presence because before his death, he owned that he was Deep Throat. And no, that's not a porn moniker. It was a nickname for him as the very mysterious source for Woodward and Bernstein's reporting on the Watergate scandal that resulted in the resignation of then-President Nixon. And sticking with my theme of no accountability, Nixon went on to receive a full pardon after his Vice President Gerald Ford took over from him. Again, those years were good times for our completely off-the-leash government. Today, I'm not so sure it's better because I still see things that remind me of those situations I've been reading about. We're still fighting the same fights as citizens and residents. We're still seeing the same sorts of pseudo-accountability apply to people who use our institutions to enact harm and lethal policies against us. But Felt was in the FBI from 1942 to 1973, which is longer than some of my listeners have been alive. He served as deputy director for a time, and when things blew up with the Weather Underground case, he was made to pay a fine and was pardoned by the then President Ronald Reagan. So that's it. One guy had to find another job. Another guy had to pay a fine, and someone else disappeared off the internet. That's what counts as government accountability in this country as we continue to wait and see if there will be any prison time in a real federal penitentiary for an ex-president who hid piles of top-secret files in his bathroom at Mar-a-Lago before he potentially gets reelected and becomes immune from prosecution again and pardons everyone else involved. The more things change, the more they stay the same. I don't want to get off into the weeds of Weather Underground's specific political plans and visions, but in 1974 the group mass-produced copies of a manifesto called Prairie Fire, The Politics of Revolutionary Anti-Imperialism, which I mentioned earlier, in which the group took credit for the Haymarket bombing. I'm linking to it in the description in case you want to buy a copy and read it. I've not read it, but the idea behind the name comes from a quote from Mao Zedong that it only takes a small spark to ignite a mighty prairie fire. Almost immediately, copies of it started showing up in coffee houses, libraries, and bookstores across the U.S. As an aside, the quote from Mao put me in mind of the Beatles song Revolution, recorded and released in 1968. So the manifesto came after the song, but I assume the similarities throughout the lyrics come purely from the zeitgeist of the time. I'm sure a lot of people were being exposed to those thoughts and ideas. I did look up the wiki entry for the song, and it sounds like Lenin waffled on the intention and the meaning, but the article does say the song was seen as a betrayal by some leftists of the time who weren't ready to discount violence in the context of revolution. Just in case there's anyone listening who hasn't heard the prior COINTELPRO episodes, just a quick summary. In April 1971, a group called Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI broke into an FBI office in Pennsylvania. As far as I could find, this was the only thing the group ever did, which was kind of funny, I guess, in sticking with the revolutionary violence theme. If you've only got one shot, make it count, right? But they stole a bunch of files and released them and exposed a heap of illegal activity going on in the FBI that targeted a lot of diverse groups, including some white supremacist groups, but by far seemed to focus on left-leaning groups and anything they could slather with the label communist. So after McCarthyism came COINTELPRO, which was like secret McCarthyism, perpetuated covertly by the Department of Justice and the executive branch of the United States government. People being surveilled, harassed, beaten, and seeing their friends assassinated knew there was some shenanigans happening, but when the break-in happened, it was an I told you so moment where nobody could deny what was going on anymore. If only they'd had Trump back then, they could have just called it a Democrat hoax and moved on as though nothing had happened. But that's COINTELPRO in a nutshell. If you want to hear more about it, go look for the episodes labeled for COINTELPRO or Google it yourself. As far as what happened next, in the mid-1970s, things appeared to have fractured. Alliances with other groups and even within the group disintegrated, and Weather Underground imploded. A few scattershot things happened in the later 1970s, and I'll give them a brief mention, but the group was all but done by the time these things took place. In November 1977, 5 members were arrested for a plot to bomb the office of John Briggs, who was a California state senator. What's interesting about that is that there were 2 FBI agents who were key witnesses in this case because their testimony was needed. But it meant they had to come forward, which blew their cover. Their names are listed as Richard J. Giannotti and William D. Reagan, but there are no wiki links associated with either one of them. I haven't even tried to Google because I already know. These FBI folks get scrubbed. When they're mentioned, there are no hyperlinks for their names. And I get not everyone mentioned in Wiki gets a hyperlink. But unless they have some other big noteworthy issue like Deep Throat, they're digitally disappeared. It reminds me of a funny personal story. Some years back, I knew there were 2 FBI agents living in a particular neighborhood. When you researched, you could find the house sales records including names of buyers and sellers. There were only 2 homes in the neighborhood for whom a buyer was not listed. So in a weird irony, having their names scrubbed actually became a method of locating where they lived. When everyone is wearing a name tag, the person without a name tag doesn't become invisible, they become conspicuous. But for the plot to bomb the Senate office, many of those on the run turned themselves in after 2 years and mainly faced fines and probation. And here let me own that the people involved got off light. In fact, a lot of Weather Underground activity got off light compared to some other groups, and it's interesting to observe the difference between the handling and the results with groups like Weather Underground in reference to their relationship with law enforcement versus what I read about the Black Panthers, for example. It's not just about enforcement seeing black versus white, it's about the privileges that come with being white and existing in white spaces. The response and handling of Weather Underground and Black Panther Party are so different as far as violence and repercussions. Let me give a great example. Henry Simmons Coleman was dean of Columbia University. During a 1968 protest on the campus by Weather Underground forerunner Students for a Democratic Society, his office was in a building that was taken over by the students. He was not in his office, but he made his way there and then was subsequently taken hostage by the protesters for 24 hours. Later, Coleman wrote letters of recommendation for the very students involved in that protest. Additionally, some of these former members for Weather Underground are now professors or retired professors. And I'm not saying that no former BPP members went on to be seen as prestigious, but Weather Underground didn't see anything like the violence aimed at BPP. And often their actions were viewed as college kids being rebellious college kids. They weren't assassinated as far as I could find. And the COINTELPRO documentation that was exposed regarding BPP showed a stark contrast in how race was viewed. But there were at least 2 members of Weather Underground, or former Weather Underground members, who did get lengthy prison sentences, Kathy Boudin and her husband David Gilbert. Kathy was raised in a family of Jewish immigrants, and her great-uncle was a prominent Marxist writer and lawyer. Her father was a leftist lawyer who defended civil rights and partnered with Viktor Rabinowitz, who defended many left-wing causes. Her brother, on the other hand, while still prominent, served as a conservative judge. So her family includes some prominent people, and she graduated from a prestigious women's college, Bryn Mawr, in 1965. In fact, she was class valedictorian. She attended law school but didn't complete her studies. Instead, she met and married a leftist activist and fellow SDS member and Weather Underground member David Gilbert during the 1970s. They had one son named Chesa. David Gilbert was also raised in a Jewish family in the Boston area, and at an early age he was fascinated with activism and racial justice. He attended Columbia University, where he continued his activism, and he co-founded the Columbia University chapter of the SDS. He described his experiences visiting Harlem and hearing Malcolm X speak as formative for him. When Kathy and David's son Chesa was only 14 months old, they were both arrested and subsequently convicted and incarcerated on felony murder based on their roles in a 1981 Brinks truck robbery gone bad. Kathy was sentenced to 20 years to life and served 23 years before being paroled. David, who was sentenced to 75 years, served 40 of that before receiving a pardon from Governor Andrew Cuomo in 2021. Kathy went on to get her doctorate and is now a professor at Columbia University. I have no update on David. Chesa, though, for those interested, was raised by another Weather Underground couple, Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, who adopted him. Dorn spent several years on the FBI's most wanted list, but her and Ayers went on to become university professors and are both now retired. The event that put Boudin and Gilbert behind bars actually happened shortly after Weather Underground dissolved. They, and one other former Weather Underground member, joined a group called the May 19 Communist Organization. In collaboration with the Black Liberation Army, the 2 groups robbed a Brinks armored truck hauling $1.6 million. The plan went south and shots were fired. In the chaos, there were 3 casualties: Brinks guard Peter Page, Police Sergeant Edward O'Grady Jr., and Police Officer Waverly Brown, who was also the first black police officer on that police force. All of the former Weather Underground members were sentenced to long prison terms, and media coverage of the event listed them as former Weather Underground members because, as I said earlier, the group was already considered defunct when these final events unfolded. There were a few more incidents with former members who had moved on to the May 19 Communist Organization and the alliance with the Black Liberation Army. Jailbreaks, robberies, and bombings until around 1985, when most of them had been arrested and sentenced either for the Brinks robbery or other resistance actions. So while the Weather Underground was operating, it accumulated a death toll of less than a dozen, all of which were their own members, who died while making bombs or during protests during the Days of Rage. The group only engaged in property damage. Now, to be fair, there is speculation about other plans, such as the Fort Dix attack mentioned earlier, that would have resulted in dozens of deaths. So I don't want to paint the group as pacifist. Also, I will readily agree that within the group there was a diversity of thought around lethal violence, and that actually played into some of the schisms that happened later and led to their demise as an organization. Growing up in the U.S. and thinking in terms of the word revolution and what that means, I'm left confused about how a group like Weather Underground can be labeled as terroristic when our founders are labeled as patriotic and heroic for behavior that was much more violent and lethal, and as a group that felt wholly justified in that violent lethality. I'm not telling anyone that Weather Underground wasn't a terrorist group. I'm just noting there's a disconnect in how we apply the label and the cognitive dissonance I experience when I try to paint one group as terrorists and the other as heroes and patriots. When I think of the lessons that I took away from the narrative of the American Revolution I was taught as a child, it seemed that a good part of what we were told was that it was fair to raise strategic targets and symbols, that if a human being or group of human beings was acting as the enforcement of an oppressive state, they were also justified targets. And I think for me, just personally, it makes sense to keep a body count as low as required to achieve ends. That is, the label justified target doesn't change the parameter of keeping a body count as low as possible. Also, it means I see some targets as unjustified. That is, bombing an arsenal is not the equivalent of bombing a school, regardless of whether the school is full of redcoat children and teachers. One is a strategic target, and the other would be non-combatants. It stands to reason that any large-scale revolution will result in some collateral damage. That is, I could aim for an arsenal and accidentally hit a school, but the school itself shouldn't be targeted. And this isn't some rule of revolution from an authoritative source. I'm just saying that as I'm thinking about revolution and what it means to me and what I would personally feel comfortable supporting, these are the lines in my head. Other people may have other lines, and some people might be able to persuade me to move my own lines, but we all have thoughts and feelings about what is and isn't okay, which is the entire point of things like conscientious objector status. For example, there's the person who signs up to join the effort, there's the person who's dragged in due to a draft, but will readily kill someone else, and there's the person who isn't prepared to kill anyone else, and is probably best left out of combat situations. That's all I'm saying. And the lines I'm discussing are not the lines that must be drawn. They're just the lines that exist in my head at this moment while I'm thinking of these things. For me, the structural and symbolic destruction of property, or something like the theft of resources in the form of that Brinks robbery, would probably fall under fair game in a fight to end an oppressive system. attacking my enemy's infrastructure, their resources, their munitions, I could probably support with a clear conscience. Bombing one of their hospitals might start separating me in my head with the revolutionary effort, even if it were a military hospital. And that could be part of my own institutional training. That idea that shooting someone standing in front of me who is holding a gun in my face strikes me as different than shooting someone in a hospital bed on a ventilator that I'm bombing to death. Am I exhibiting the very hypocrisy with this that I called out earlier in talking about the lethal state institutions and how distinctions between the deaths they cause and direct murder are arbitrary? I mean, maybe. The British had their redcoat forces scattered throughout the U.S. colonies as enforcers, basically no different than we'd think of police today. So would local police be justified targets to the founders? Would the FBI? Would the president working with the FBI to perpetuate a program like COINTELPRO? Just asking a question like this can be enough for some folks to really become uncomfortable. But how do I not think about this when the label revolution is raised in the context of the United States, which itself is a nation born out of a very violent, very deadly revolution? I suppose it's hard to tally deaths from a mess like that, but online it says that between 25,000 and 70,000 people were killed just on the colony side. Some died in battle, some died from disease, some died due to conditions in prison camps. I'm just noting that I grew up taught that revolutions come with death tolls, and I was told those tolls can be justified. The same people dying on the colony side were busy killing the redcoat side, and this was just how it was. Lexington, Concord, Boston, Ticonderoga, Bunker Hill, Norfolk, and countless other battles. And in all my U.S. history and American history books, I never once heard anyone calling these people anything but patriots. Certainly not terrorists, although the British might have used that label had it been around then. But it's around now, and we don't use it in our history books. Only in our present-day reporting of revolutions and rebellions. And yes, I've heard the quote, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. I guess all this is the reason for that quote. But allow yourself to think about it if you haven't already. I don't mean to assume, I don't think that just because I'm talking about this now means that I'm the first person to ever grapple with this in my head. For all I know, I could be the last one to the party. But during the colonial period, the British government maintained a colonial administration in the American colonies that included British authorities, such as governors, judges, and military troops stationed in and around the colonies. The British authorities were responsible for enforcing the laws, collecting taxes, maintaining order in the colonies. They were also responsible for protecting the colonies from external threats, such as attacks from Native American tribes, French colonial forces, or Spanish forces. And think as well there about the framing of the battles between Britain and native tribes. All the same questions are raised. Still, the relationship between the British authorities and the colonial population was often tense because the leaders of the colonies resented the British control and infringements of what they considered to be their rights and liberties. The British, on the other hand, were maintaining the status quo. And when the founders decided that enough was enough, they didn't just attack empty buildings like banks and armories and barracks. I mean, they started that way to some degree with the Boston Tea Party going after property. But they attacked any establishment or enforcement of British colonial rule, including human beings. The declaration I began this episode with justified, in their minds, all of it. But then they set up a constitution and a society that oppressed nearly everyone who wasn't them. And suddenly, violent response to their oppressive government was illegal. And round we go until today it's labeled as outright terrorism. If Weather Underground targeted federal-level enforcers of an oppressive system that was carrying out summary citizen executions, abusing the legal system, and also engaging in illegal harassment of citizens with the help of state authorities and institutions, then we'd be pretty arbitrary about calling them terrorists while the founders are patriots. As always, I'm not telling anyone what to think about these erased parts of history. My goal is to make people aware of them, but as I become aware of them, I'm forced to confront part of history that I then need to grapple with, and you all get the front row seat to what happens in my head as I dig deeper down into these holes. There's a reason the podcast is called At Home in My Head. I'm opening my head here and showing you what's in there, how it works, where it goes, what it's like being me. The U.S. is very selective about the history it encourages us to remember and the history it encourages us to forget. I grew up in the 70s and barely remember these things. They are a foggy, hazy period of history. And yet, I remember things like the bombings in Ireland very clearly. And that's actually creepy. As someone who was religiously indoctrinated years ago, this has a very familiar feel to me, and I can't say how others will respond. Is there someone out there thinking, yes, I remember all this like it was yesterday? Is there someone else saying, yeah, I don't remember this either? Is there someone saying, our teacher went over this with us in U.S. history? Or someone saying, I never learned this in school? I have no idea, except that author Brian Burrow, who covered a lot of the violence during this time period, titled his book, The Forgotten Age of Revolution. So there's a clue for us all. In fact, nearly every time I do one of these history erased episodes, there are books or articles that start with the title, The Forgotten Whatever. But forgetting a trend like several bombings a day is a pretty big forget. So decide for yourself how you feel about what the Weather Underground was doing. Draw your own lines, but remember that it happened. Remember the time when we had a revolution that didn't work out, not just the time we had one that did. And maybe, if you haven't already, spend some time thinking about where your lines are drawn and how and why you're drawing them. If you heard a story about a British judge releasing redcoats after they'd assassinated colonists for holding a meeting in the town square where they called for an end to oppressive British rule, would you understand why revolution? So, if state police work with the FBI to execute Fred Hampton, breaking a whole list of their own laws, and nobody is ever held to account for it, would you understand why revolution? That's it for this episode of At Home in My Head, exploring experience and meaning in individuals and the broader society. Like and subscribe if you enjoy these talks, and in the meantime, stay safe, be well, and never stop exploring.